All right, folks are still coming in, but let's do this. Welcome, I'm Marcy Singer-Gabella, Faculty Director of the Nashville Partnership for Educational Equity Research, and or PEER, and I'm really excited to welcome you to the first of what we hope will be a regular series of conversations exploring research practice partnership work. It's wonderful to see so many friends on the in the chat on the list of attendees. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of PEER very quickly, and then I will lay out the session for you and we'll dive in. But PEER, which launched this past fall, is a research practice partnership, or an RPP, between Metro Nashville Public Schools and Vanderbilt. We are committed to identifying and eradicating educational inequities in Nashville by understanding Metro's core challenges and their strengths, and then drawing on these understandings to co-design, evaluate, and scale solutions, and so to improve educational practice and policy in ways that promote equitable opportunity and outcomes for students and their families. Essential to PEER's launch has been a core team of Metro and Peabody stakeholders who have served on a partnership planning group, our steering committee, a faculty advisory group, and some other kinds of activities. And their names are listed collectively on this slide. We've been deeply appreciative of the Metro team, who have invested an incredible amount of time and thought in planning and managing to do so amidst the extraordinary demands of this crazy long moment. Before we get going, I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Peabody Research Office, and particularly Chris Van Aggs, who helped to organize this session. Also, thanks to Jessica Holter, PEER's Director of Communications, and to Brian Smokler, who set up the Zoom registration and is handling recording and other logistics. And finally, a big thanks to Dean Camilla Bembo and Executive Associate Dean Ellen Goldring for their phenomenal support for PEER over the last year and a half as we've been planning and launching. So, all right, the structure of our next 55 minutes or so is as follows. Each of our panelists is going to introduce themselves and note the experience that they are bringing to this conversation. Then I'll pose and panelists will respond to 4 questions about the nature and challenges and opportunities of our PP work. And then we will open up to Q&A. Please use the Q&A button for any questions you have at any point, and we'll do our best also to address these. We'll do our best to address them during the hour. If there are lingering questions, we'll follow up afterwards. So just make sure that we have your name and a way to contact you. And then, time permitting, we'll close with a quick last word for each of our panelists. All right, so now on to a round of introductions. Panelists, you each have 2 minutes to describe the experience you're bringing to this discussion of RPPs. And I am going to pick Joe because you are at the top of my screen of panelists right now. So why don't you start?
Thanks, Marcy. My name is Joe Webby. I'm the chair of the Department of Special Education here at Peabody Vanderbilt. And I think I bring to this partnership work, a long history of working collaboratively with Metro Nashville Public Schools. And, you know, I think I've been doing partnership work without even knowing I was doing partnership work, because the importance of understanding sort of the perspectives and needs of the school district has really focused my research agenda, which is mostly around children with or at risk for social and emotional disorders as well too. And what I've learned in those 30 plus years that I've been doing the work with the district is this idea of that my work doesn't contribute much if it's not meeting the needs of the district. And the information and the partnership that the district has provided with me in terms of their priorities, where their needs are, what where those things are connected, has really sort of, I think, made my work better, and hopefully has made experiences of teachers and students in the district a little bit better as well too. And it's just this idea of sort of open communication, which is, I think, essential to any partnership, and recognizing that the way that I've done my work and the way that they've informed my work has really been beneficial, I think, for all.
Thank you. All right, Nicole, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Marcy. So I'm Nicole Joseph. I am an associate professor of mathematics education in the Department of Teaching and Learning. And I think the experience and certain level of expertise that I can bring to this conversation is really thinking about the interrogation of power relations that often are going to show up when you're trying to develop deep, rich partnerships with school districts. And I'm a recent awardee, and we'll get into that a little bit more, of a research partnership. And there's just a lot to consider. I think it takes a certain level of savviness and humility to be willing to engage in these types of conversations, but they are really important, I think, to successful partnerships.
Thank you. Maury.
Hi, good morning. My name is Maureen Nation. I'm a professor in human and organizational development. And I was thinking about both Nicole and Joe's comments, and particularly Joe, I would just say ditto, except I'm a little younger, so I haven't been doing it quite so long. But, you know, I think one of the things that I realize as we've started to talk more about partnership is, as Joe said, this has just been the way in which I was taught to do research and think about research. And I believe that one of our most important opportunities is to engage with partners to do research that changes lives and you know, supports the kind of social structures that we know are necessary for kids to be successful. So whether it's with schools or with community partners or with parents, I mean, finding ways to have a conversation that goes both ways. And I really want to lift up what Nicole said about power, because that, I think, is one of the core issues, is for us as researchers being willing to enter conversations, not as the expert, but as a person who brings some skills to the enterprise, but not necessarily all the answers for that enterprise. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Metro Nashville, because and to see their willingness to engage in that conversation, because my personal belief is that this is where real education research is going, because of the difficult problems that are facing public education.
Thank you, Maury. And in fact, actually, the NAS report that was released yesterday on the future of IES research, I think, underscores what you've just said. We can get into that a little bit further. Jason, why don't you finish this out?
Sure. I'm Jason Grissom, and I'm a professor in leadership policy and organizations. And I'm also the faculty director of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, which we call TERRA. And TERRA is a research practice partnership that primarily with the Tennessee Department of Education. So it's a state level partnership. It involves a lot of other state level stakeholder groups as well. So, you know, some of the issues at the state level are a little bit different, which we can get into. But we are an RPP that does research to inform the state school improvement efforts. So again, our primary target is the state, although increasingly we've been partnering with school districts on some specific projects as well. So historically, TERRA's work has been in areas like school turnaround or teacher professional learning issues, more generally around teachers and leaders. And that work continues, but we've also had some more recent focus on COVID response at the state and local levels.
Okay, thank you all. You've all thrown out some wonderful seeds for us to pick up on as we continue the conversation. I'm going to shift into the first of our 4 questions, and it picks up on the slide that you're looking at right now. A few years ago, the WT Grant Foundation commissioned a group of leading RPP researchers, including Caitlin Farrell, Bill Panuel, Cynthia Coburn, Julia Daniel, Louisa Spiel, and to develop a kind of a state of the field paper on research practice partnerships. And in the paper, which WT Grant published last year, they offered a redefinition of research practice partnerships, which you are looking at. And the new definition emphasizes 5 aspects of RPPs. They're long-term collaborations. They work toward educational improvement or equitable transformation. Research is the leading activity in the work. They're carefully designed to tap a diversity of expertise, and they use tools and strategies intentionally to shift power relations and ensure equitable participation in the research. And I'm going to ask Nicole to kind of lead off a conversation about this quote. And I'm wondering what about this definition resonates most with you, and whether there were any surprises here.
Definitely no surprises, but several things I think resonate with me. First of all, my new research practice partnership with Cynthia Chappell, who is the founder of Black Girls Do STEM in St. Louis. It's a new one for me. But the ideas of thinking together, co-collaborating, figuring out what people are interested in researching and understanding has always been the way that I've approached research. But I think 2 things. One, this idea of a diverse set of expertise and the university faculty or group of faculty members being the expert is really important. Cynthia was a former research chemist. She was born and raised in St. Louis. She knows the history of the inequalities in St. Louis. And she started Black Girls Do STEM just out of a deep commitment of not seeing formal schools, support Black girls in their development of, confidence in STEM. And so her expertise is incredible. And was a beautiful intersection with me, someone who's trying to figure these things out. And this partnership, we hope, will be long-term. So we are already, thinking about an NSF grant through the ASO program, which is like informal learning. And so that's one. And then the second piece is this idea of power. So even though both of us identify as Black women, there are still things that, I have been trying to make sure we discuss, and dispositions that I bring to the table. So it's always about co-collaborating. It's always about co-constructing. I try to position myself where I am a co-learner as well. And sometimes the partner, because they feel like, oh, you're a PhD or you're whatever, that they don't have the expertise, or that they can't always, they don't feel like they can contribute. So that's another thing that sometimes I have to do, is remind her of all of this wonderful knowledge that she brings. And so I think those 2 ideas are very important if you want to have a successful partnership with the community or school districts. And I'm sure Maury and Joe will tell us that when it's at the district level, it's even more probably complex than just, sort of working with one person.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to jump in on this to respond?
I think Nicole's, I really appreciate her comments and the early comments that she and Maury made about this sort of connection and communication and those sorts of things. And when I think about from a research lens, oftentimes we hear about big problems, right? There's problems with dropout, there's problems with math scores, there's problem with STEM and whatever. And that's sort of kind of a universal assumption that every school is having those same problems. And I think those problems might look a little different. And without communicating that, in a way that this is what the local need is. And when I say local, it's either local district or local school or local classroom. Then if I go in and say, hey, I'm going to help your dropout rate, I'm probably not really going to understand. That's going to be me trying to direct things that may not be important. And I'll just sort of add, in a very sort of micro level, we're currently working in schools on a classroom behavior management program, and we've asked teachers to identify target children, right? And so we kind of confirm those things, and what we noticed is some of the students that teachers listed as problematic, we're not seeing the problems. And instead of saying they're bad actors or they're not good, they don't know their kids, we're now stepping back and saying we need to talk to them and say, where's what we look at for problem behavior or students of concern? What did you look at? And so, because I think that's going to help us meet the needs of that classroom, but also it advances research because it helps us think about better ways to sort of develop tools or assessments that may actually capture what's most concerning that teachers are really worried about or schools are worried about. So I think that level of taking the big areas of issues and really narrowing them down to sort of the local level is a really big part of this, of a successful partnership.
There's two pieces that you pulled out there that I think are so important. One is this idea that it's not our questions at the university that are driving. It's not like I, as a researcher, have a question and I go and I enter a district and I say, hey, I want to gather data here. But it's really a question that is jointly constructed, and it's driven by the needs of the district. And the other one has to do with this issue of voice, which Nicole also brought in, right? You know, that it's that we need to kind of put aside our assumptions and our lenses to make sure that we are creating spaces for the voices and expertise of the people who are kind of closest to what the issue is. And I think that those are really important.
Well, I think, you know, let's not sugarcoat this. I mean, the purpose of research is knowledge, right? So we're trying to generate new knowledge, but the idea is to make sure that knowledge that we're generating is really advancing research and what we know, but also at the same time advancing the progress that schools want to see in these areas. So it's really, you know, I could go on this one question for hours. I'll stop talking.
Can I also just jump in, Marcy? Because of the way that we are socialized when we, you know, get our PhDs and, you know, become researchers, I think this can be challenging sometimes to step aside and to actually co-construct or even, you know, participatory action research. It's not even about your question at all. It's, you know, what folks want to study and understand. And so I just want to say that, you know, if there is some list or tips that we can develop, you know, to help people understand, like, what is the process that it takes to actually develop a disposition of humility and, you know, stepping to the side, if you will, to really allow the people who we are trying to support, you know, to elevate their voices and to give their voices power. Yeah, so that's all. Just that it's hard and we probably need some tips on how to do it.
I was just going to follow up on what Nicole said, and that there is a type of socialization that happens. And I don't know that I've seen that so much, especially among my faculty colleagues, but I have seen this attitude that there's almost an assumption that district folk are there to help us do our research. And to the degree that they don't do that somehow they don't care about kids, or, you know, they're trying to be obstinate in some way, or and, you know, I think it's just a kind of fundamental kind of misunderstanding of the research enterprise as far as I'm concerned, because it really should be grounded in this way of co-creating or co-understanding what the issues are that need this type of research engagement.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna shift in, because Jason, I think we've kind of begun to open up into this next question that you said that you would lead on, which is, you know, what in your experience makes RPP research really different from more researcher driven research, and what does that afford?
Yeah, so I mean, we are starting to cover this already, but you know, I mean, the real difference is that research practice partnerships are organized around research use. So the goal is that the outcome of the research is used, so that is used to make changes that are useful for kids in classrooms and so forth. So either changes in specifically in practice, or, you know, in the case of Tara, often it's changes in policy that are beneficial. And so, you know, really to sort of think about, well, how does that work? I mean, I actually can go back and call out two parts of the definition, Marcy, that you put up just a second ago. One of those, the pieces that we've been talking about is the have a say piece that was there, having a say in the joint work. And the recognition that there's two sides of the partnership. You know, if you think about it, sort of just split in half, sort of the researcher side and the practice side, just to make it simple. But really they're working together. And so there's joint ownership of the research process and the translation of research into action process. And so what does joint ownership means? Well, joint ownership starts with, you know, jointly constructing questions and jointly constructing a research agenda. But then it doesn't just stop there, right? It's involvement throughout the research process, and different kinds of research, that what that involvement might look like, you know, might be different, but it's very intentional. So the other piece to call out from your definition is this intentionally organized piece. And that part is really important, because that doesn't happen by accident, right? So you have to have processes in place to facilitate this kind of interaction between researchers and the practice or policy partners on the other side, because neither side knows how to do this well, right? It's not really natural for either sort of side of the equation. And so you spend a lot of time figuring out what the processes look like to ensure that joint ownership. And so, you know, we think of it as at Tara sort of like processes for feed in and feedback. So, you know, feed in, meaning on the front end, you're thinking about what are the questions and what's the best way to go after those questions, right? What is research design? What kinds of research design choices even make sense? Now you might think, well, researchers bring that kind of expertise, and that is true. That's what how researchers are trained to think. But people on the practice side also have insight into research design, because they know a lot about the details about implementation and how things are rolling out that the researcher often doesn't know. And those things are really relevant to how you're going to study the question, right? And so that sort of thinking about bringing the partners in on the front end is not just, because how it's going to pay off later because of ownership, but also it really informs the research, and it makes a difference in how you approach the questions, and I think yields a better research process. But then the feedback piece is like, in the traditional researcher-driven kind of process, we often think, well, the researcher asks, presents a question and then goes and gets some data, and then they're going to come back 3 years later with what their findings are, and it's like this big revelatory, ta-da! Here's my paper, here's my presentation that tells you what I learned. But in the RPP process, like the way we think about it at Tara is there's sort of check-in points along the way. Like one of the first things that we try to always do, we're often doing quantitative work, but we try to think about, well, let's go in and just show some descriptives. Let's think about what are sort of the initial things that we are finding, that are even like the pre-work before we're getting to the research questions, because that stuff is often really valuable. It creates an opportunity for the people on the practice side to question the assumptions that are built into where you're going, point out problems with the data. I mean, there's lots of ways that's really valuable. And so we try to build those check-in points along the way. And the other thing that really does, I think, is help. It builds ownership, but it also builds trust, right? We're very fond at Tara of saying we have a strict no surprises rule. So there is nothing that we present publicly that has not been vetted by the folks on the practice side and digested and discussed and had an opportunity to really say, well, I don't think you're interpreting this right, or I would have looked at it this way, or what about this policy change we made in 2015 that the researchers say, oh, I didn't even know that happened, right? And that is important for me to incorporate. And so there's many ways in which I think the sort of RPP way of doing things is pretty different from the more researcher-driven traditional model.
Thank you. Super helpful. Jason, can you push a little bit more on what the affordance is. I mean, you mentioned that, you know, the goal is to make a difference in practice. So we go through all of this, and I want to call out my colleague, Caroline Marks, who is absolutely brilliant at facilitating these kinds of conversations. We're bringing researchers and practitioners together and making sure that everybody's got a voice, you know, and that the work is truly kind of a co-construction. So in the end, you've been at this for a while now with Tara. What are the key affordances from your perspective?
You know, that the goal, you know, to go back to what I said at the very beginning, the goal is use. And so when the process works well, when both sides are bought in to the questions, to the research approach, to the interpretation of the research, you know, the hope then is that you've created a product that is valuable on the policy or practice side, and that it will, you know, change the way that things are done, or maybe it reinforces the way things are already done. I mean, that is also a possibility. But you know, again, it's hard to get there because it isn't, as I said, it isn't natural. It isn't, we're all kind of on the research side. So we're thinking about the ways that it isn't natural on the research side to sort of engage with partners in this way. But it's also not natural sort of on the practice side, where your goal is to do your job, like you have an infinite number of tasks if you're working in a school or a school district to accomplish in a day. And now you have to, you know, work with researchers, you have to make the time, you have to, you know, try to be conversant in a way of thinking that is maybe you weren't trained to do, or it you know, is not sort of certainly not often part of your regular workday. And so that, you know, sort of recognition of the level of intentionality and the scaffolding and the work that goes into being able to build the capacity on both sides to do this is, I think, really key.
Thank you. So you've set up the next question really well, and I'd like to ask Maureen to take the lead in answering this. What unique challenges does partnership research pose? Again, Jason, you've started to kind of lay these out, and how have you overcome them?
So Jason, actually, you hit the one that was at the top of my list, which was time. I mean, I think, and time in a couple of different dimensions. One is for our community partners, because as you said, there's no shortage of things on their side. And sometimes even in our desire to be helpful, it's possible to get in the way by you know, really wanting to have these engagements to actually prevent them from being able to do what it is that they need to do. And of course, on the researcher side, there's also an issue of time. And you know, we're all aware of the clock ticking, especially for those who are in tenure line positions. And you know, to me, the critical piece of a research practice partnership is relationship. And that doesn't come quickly and kind of hectically around trying to get a particular thing done. It actually comes more from being in the same spaces and understanding each other's questions and motivations and needs, and being able to incorporate that into the working relationship. And you know, for that reason, I think sometimes even when there's great ideas out there, that you know, it's not actually worth it to kind of push through real quickly to get something done that you know, everybody might agree is, hey, that's a good thing, if it leaves behind one partner or another. And so such that it's not actually a collaboration, but actually ends up being owned by the researcher. And a couple of other things that I would just add to that is flexibility, I think is, and we've also talked a little bit about this, is the willingness to let go of the things that you walk into the door thinking of potentially as your priorities. You know, one of the things that I think has been most helpful to me in this regard is that, you know, my goal has always been to help schools be great places for kids to thrive. And I don't have any research question that is over and above that. I mean, that I would prioritize above that. So when I'm having a conversation, if there's another idea that moves us collectively closer to that, you know, I'm happy to to leave the conversation, the things that I brought in the door behind, if in fact we can engage in a way that moves our collective goals forward. The last thing I'll mention is I think there is always this issue of balancing the needs of applied settings with research design, with kind of strict research designs. And I think you're always trying to figure out where is that line between making sure that you're doing something that allows you to answer the questions without imposing so much structure on the situation that it kind of alienates those who are engaged in it, if that makes sense. I mean, is that you don't want to say it's got to be done this way so that we can answer the question, but in the process actually lose that issue of collaboration and co-construction. And what I would say is that for all of these things, it's hard, as multiple people have mentioned, and I know I don't fall on the right side of these things all the time. What I would say is that this is one of those places where you really do hope to engage with your partner in a way that conveys respect and appreciation, even if you miss it sometimes, that they understand that it doesn't come from a place of entitlement and such, but really wanting to do the best for your collective partnership.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a ton in what you've just offered, Maury. I'm wondering whether any of the panelists want to pick up on any piece for a minute and add.
I mean, I always admire how Maury speaks so passionately about the work that he does and the commitment he has to making schools, agencies better for kids and the people that work in them as well too. So this idea about, understanding, what, and I think this is hard, and I'm not afraid to admit that it's hard, that, the idea of sort of saying, sometimes you have to sort of pivot in a way if you can't bring everybody along with you. And I think that's an important lesson that I think probably we are not really good at in some ways. And I think that's something that and also I think perhaps constructing better conversations about who the partners are, right? And so sometimes we think about, I sometimes think, and a lot of times, that my partners are classroom teachers, right? And that's probably whom, but I also need to understand that the partners might be the coaches who come support them and the administrators that are paying them and the districts who are, so it's really thinking about how do you bring those partners together. And not every partner is going to be interested in everything that we do. And I understand that, but just sort of the idea of creating a culture that sort of invites that team approach, I think is something that, from a lot of different ways, Nicole's statement about sometimes we're viewed as the experts and we should know everything. And and this idea of sort of really rethinking this, I think is what is sort of where my thoughts are listening to what Maury talked about.
Yeah, and this other piece about continuously thinking about who are our stakeholders. And I think that has to happen throughout the process of the research. It's not only checking on findings together and sort of, stepping through, but as we move through, we learn more about the context, and we learn more about who are these, sort of who needs to be at this table, and informing our perspective in some way. And that's not necessarily part, again, of this enculturation that we have as faculty and as researchers. And so I want to use that as an opportunity to kind of recall some of the things you all have talked about, our socialization as researchers, our incentives as researchers, sort of these norms about how research should be conducted and structured. And one of the big pieces that we're trying to think about at Peer is, how do we build capacity, not only in Metro to engage in partnership research, but at Vanderbilt, to have folks on our side who are ready to step into these to this kind of work with all of its complexity. And so, Joe, I'm wondering whether you could lead us off in thinking about how Peer and Vanderbilt could best support partnership research. How can we build our own capacity? Are there resources or structures that you think would be helpful, or other ways of thinking about this?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things that have gone through my mind, just even since we've been talking about this, and even just in the last 30 minutes that people talked about. I think part of it is, one, perhaps is sort of modeling collaborations within our own college in some ways, right? So, who's doing work, who's taking the different approaches, and for us to really learn from each other about sort of studying things. And I can draw connections to the work that many people are doing, including Maury, and the work that I do, and how those connections and how our approaches, and I think that understanding that lens within our own campus as a whole makes us a better partner for others, right? And it improves the work, right? And so I think that's a part of it as well too. I do think that creating a system for the district to share kind of frequently sort of where their priorities are, and again, it goes back to Maury's point of time, but really, is there a mechanism in place of saying, this is what our priorities are, this is what we're dealing with. We can read about them in the paper, we see them on the website and other places, but it's really that sort of communication where there's an opportunity for us to say, hey, interestingly, I'm interested in that topic as well too, and this is the approach that I'm taking. Let's have a conversation about how this might actually advance the knowledge that research is supposed to do, but also creates that benefit that you're looking for in this particular area. So this is glib and not meant to be, but it's really about the lines of communication that are existing, and how those can be improved in a way. We can talk about data sharing and those sorts of things, and I think those are more formal structures that are helpful, but it's really about creating dialogue, I think, and not no offense to this, not a 1-hour webinar about what we're doing, but really sort of these kind of conversations where the district has decisions they make, and I think we can help with some of those decisions, but they can help us with our decisions as well too. So it's really, for me, it's about, I see Peer as sort of a gateway for communication and formal communications and dialogue that really shares that. And I think but I do think for us to support partnership research, I think we have to do a better job of communicating within our own campus about ways of doing it. And I've actually learned a lot just even in our interactions over the last year and a half about ways to think about things and different ways to sort of, even the measurement simply is something I think I've learned a lot about. And so that to me is really that's how we can best support partnership, is really supporting partnerships within our own campus that can then sort of move forward in a more directed partnership with the district.
Thank you. I'm curious whether other folks on the call have thought about this as well. And there's actually a question which I think is really helpful that came from one of the attendees about, can we speak to how Metro collaborators are perceiving the RPP and its approach? It's a little odd to hear from one side when the talk is about collaboration, and I agree 100%. There is something odd about the structure of this webinar. Our goal, or our conversation, our goal here today is really to kind of introduce the Vanderbilt stakeholders. We've actually had tremendous involvement so far on the Metro side. We've had a couple of groups. We've had conversations going. There's some kind of seedling projects that are ongoing. But we want to make sure that we, as on the Vanderbilt side, are ready to walk into these conversations, and that we're doing everything that we can to be able to incentivize and nurture the work. So this is kind of our stepping back and saying, who are we as we walk into this partnership? But I'm wondering whether Jason, Maureen, Nicole, as you've begun to think also about doing partnership work, or the conversations that we've had more recently, whether there are things that you think that that Peer needs to do, that Peabody could do, that Vanderbilt could do, that would help to make us better at it, at this work.
We're all looking to see who's going to unmute first. I'll go. I mean, I agree with what Joe just said about communication for sure, and sort of modeling. I also think, given the issues that have been coming up, and just how different this style of work is from, often the more traditional approaches. I mean, I think, Peabody has a big scholarly community, and some people's work does this already, or gets very close. They may not think of it in this way, but their work is pretty close to the model of what we're talking about here. Other people are further away, but maybe in their current work, but would be interested. And I think part of it is creating the conversation about partnership across campus. And maybe, there's even, there's probably a role even for thinking about being more systematic about talking about how this kind of work is done, and what mindsets it requires, and what skills it requires. I think in terms of really trying to create opportunities for the people in this community to learn about those things, and how to do it. I got a lot to learn too, and I've been at this, I think, for a while, and I think we could have more sort of systematic conversations, or think about, especially for our graduate students, and many graduate students are like really hungry to do this kind of work, and to think about, well, maybe we should be offering classes to think about, what the skills and mindsets and competencies are. But it starts with like just recognition of what the particular challenges, but also big benefits of doing this kind of work.
I like your suggestion, Jason. I was thinking similarly that having more opportunities for folks to engage around the types of skill sets and mindsets that fit for doing this type of research, I think would be something fantastic, especially for our graduate students. And one of the things, working in a counseling program, and one of the things that we often acknowledge is that not everybody's designed to be a counselor. I mean, they don't have the skill sets or the aptitudes. And I think we should also acknowledge not everyone is designed to work in research practice partnerships. I mean, but for those who are interested to provide the types of supports and opportunities to learn those skill sets, I think would be a great thing. I think the other thing that came to mind as Joe and Jason were talking is that one of the things that we've talked a bit about has been the power sharing between researchers and practitioners. I would also just say, one of the things I think we can also attend to is the institutional power differentials. And, you know, I think, and then what I mean by that is that, you know, there's both in terms of research resources, as well as, you know, cachet. I mean, that the institution can often, if not careful, you know, engage in ways that yeah, doesn't necessarily promote partnership. And I think, I don't think it's necessarily intentional. I just think that that's one of the things that we need to be aware of and careful about as we think about, as an institution, how to engage with the district.
And Maureen, I'll add to that, because I think it speaks directly to my experience. I mean, y'all know that I'm just gonna keep it 100. I mean, I honestly didn't choose to do a research practice partnership my first few years here, because I knew that I was on this clock, and I knew that I had to, you know, pump out papers. And the reality is that I don't, you know, it's not about going, getting, leaving, right? It's deep. You guys have explained that it's deep relationships. It takes time. You have to build trust, respect, all of these things that are important for a successful and robust, you know, type of RPP. And so we definitely need to just be honest and have courageous conversations about these types of things, because, you know, now that I'm on the other side of tenure, this is why one of the first projects that I'm doing is an RPP, because because of the institutional, you know, expectations around Vanderbilt. I mean, I was very clear about where I am and what I have to deliver. But I think if we're just open and honest about those conversations, and to give people nuggets or things to think about, like, how do you decide, you know, because some people might still decide to do it, right? Even though they're on a tenure track line. And so as we are developing courses, workshops, whatever that is, I would definitely like for those conversations to be a part of, or for those things to be a part of those conversations.
What I hear you saying is that there's almost a need to have to help people think strategically about, if I am going to be doing partnership work pre-tenure, then part of what I need to do, I need to kind of think through, how am I going to manage that? How am I going to engage in that research, you know, that co-construction of research questions, and have my work shaped in part, significant part, by the timelines that come with our partners. And think about, how do I, you know, sort of, how do I strategically position that work, and how do I make sure that I am doing, you know, getting those publications out at the same time that we're generating products that are meaningful to our partners. There's almost, I can imagine, you know, having examples of tenure portfolios that are based on partnership research that would be really helpful for folks who wanted to go into this work.
That would be amazing, Marcy. Also methodologically, you know,
Yep.
if you are quantitative, I mean, it is what it is. Those, you know, those things are a little bit quicker. But if you're mixed methods, or, you know, other types of qualitative, it, you know, it takes a little bit longer. So that would be wonderful if we could have some portfolios.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add something real quick. I know we want to leave time for questions, but this is something that Jason said that sort of made me think a little bit about this whole idea about, you know, this notion of implementation and implementation science and stuff. And I think part of what we maybe fail to do, maybe I'm talking to myself only, is it's sort of we have a, you know, 3 or 4 year RCT. We wait till the end of the term of the experiment. We publish our results, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done tracking those years, right? And I think, you know, and we think about, and this is where I think the partnership piece really comes in is helping to co-construct the ideas of what are the supports and barriers that might be in place for implementation of evidence, right? And so I certainly don't think that, I think that you could develop a nice sort of, you can do your large scale project, but there's opportunities for sort of tracking and mapping and describing sort of really implementation issues for me, both supports and barriers that I think really is part and parcel with this whole idea of a partnership. And so I think Nicole's point about sort of methodologies and stuff, I think there's partnerships around that kind of, you can do both, right? And you can develop a strong portfolio of work in a line of research that's leading, that may end in some RCT at some point, if that's what you're choosing to do, but there's a path to an opportunity for understanding that path, that trip to the end of the results, that I think we probably don't do as well as we should do.
Great. We have another question, and Nicole mentioned being awarded an RPP. If we're interested in a project that could be appropriate for peer, how do we apply to engage in that work? And so I just want to note that Nicole's RPP is actually separate from peer. And I'd love for you to describe how you went about doing that. And I can also share very quickly, and then happy to go into more depth about the way in which peer projects are initially getting going, in that we have a steering committee that has identified a set of research priority areas, and we are putting together faculty working groups that take a research priority area identified by the steering committee and begin to really think about what are the problems of practice here. And from that conversation, develop, and these working groups include folks from the Vanderbilt side and from the Metro side, the kind of the appropriate stakeholders who bring knowledge or position in relation to that question. And then they begin to think about, okay, so, sort of what's the research agenda? What is the, kind of who are the people who also need to be at this table? And I would invite faculty who are interested in getting attached to peer working groups just to let us know that you're really interested. And I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. But Nicole, do you want to answer how you went about getting your RPP?
Sure. So Peabody Small Grants, they have two, I think, a few options, and one of those options is an RPP. And since this was my, I would say, first formal RPP, I decided to apply, and that came about because the organization found me on Twitter. I'm going to tell you guys, get Twitter accounts. Found me on Twitter and invited me to do a talk with the families at the Black Girls Do STEM. And that's kind of how we started talking. And, she followed back up, and, we just began to talk. And that was like, I don't know, maybe 8 months before we applied for an RPP. But we were just, engaging, talking about the program. And she began to say things like, I really want to understand like what parts of this organization is actually helping Black girls increase their curiosity. Is it helping them to choose math majors? She wanted to know some of these things, and that's how we kind of began to think about, this is a problem of practice that she has identified. And there are levels of partnerships. Mine is not like peer, which is like a whole district. Mine is a community organization, but in terms of the aims and in terms of the outcomes where we're really trying to improve or engage in social transformation, those things are exactly the same. It's just the level of implementation. So that's how I got that one, was through our Peabody Small Grant.
Yeah, and I want to thank again the Peabody Research Office for thinking about including RPPs, calling out RPPs as a small grant opportunity. It's a fantastic way for us to begin to develop capacity and to try out small scale projects and learn about the work together. So Chris Van Aggs had just put a link. I can copy this link to the whole chat so that you can learn more about these. All right. We have just, three or 4 minutes. Are there any other questions in the audience? Not seeing any. Okay. Well, please.
Well, I did have a question for Maureen.
Okay. Yeah.
I put it
Go
in the
ahead.
chat, and Maureen, it was so beautiful the way you talked about flexibility. And so I'm always interested in like faculty development, like how do we do this? And so I was just curious, did you start when you decided to begin work, probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I'm not sure, research practice partnerships, did you have that deep understanding about flexibility, or was that an evolution over time, just wisdom of learning things that you began to approach them in that way?
I would say just real quickly, I mean, it kind of goes back to the issue of socialization, because part of this was a struggle with how I was socialized to do research versus how I felt comfortable doing it. And particularly with even when I was in graduate school, some of the community partners that I started working with then, it was really to say, I'm interested in what you're doing. And is there a way to be involved and to be helpful? Here are some skill sets that I have that might be helpful to you. And to be able to have that type of conversation. And to also, one of the things that I think was most important early on is that by having that conversation, I started to be able to understand the issues and the context within which the partner is operating, and the questions that they're going to have to answer, which may be very different from the questions that a researcher might answer. So, and to give you an example, I had a conversation probably 20, 25 years ago with a principal where, we were talking about working together. And I said to him, here's something that I think might work, but I want to understand what you're doing and what you believe in, because if this doesn't work, they're not going to come looking for me. I mean, they're going to hold you. You're the one that's being held accountable to having this school function well. So let's figure out a way that fits with the way in which you understand the world and operate. And here's a whole bunch of things that we know from research that might be effective for you. And I'm happy to engage in that conversation, but not to go in and say, hey, here's your answer, but to really understand where they are. And I remember, the first thing he said is that attendance, achievement, and behavior, we need to figure out a way to have some impact on those things. Important to know as we start a partnership.
Thank you. I see that we are at noon, and I want to be, with respect to the folks who have been listening in, and also to our panelists, our phenomenal panelists who have given their time and their expertise. As I said, we hope this is the first in many conversations. And so I want to thank you all so much for being here and for your contributions. And we look forward to continuing soon.